Today I'm here to talk about none other than Durin. I've been playing him for a while, so I had the chance to test him, calculate all of his builds, and try many of his teams against the upcoming Stygian rotation. He's a unit I'm genuinely hyped about. High damage potential, great buffs, and it plays in an absurd number of teams. On top of that, he's tied to a new system, kind of a resonance, that's being added to the game and buffs some of the OGs of Genshin. And honestly, I couldn't be happier with these changes. Disclaimer, this is an early access video, but it will serve as a full guide with everything you need to know about him. Let's go in order. Durin is a Hexerai character, and if your party has at least 2 of them, a special talent becomes active. That's it. Aside from Durin, these are the units that can trigger the effect. For him, the passive is quite strong, but as we will see, not mandatory. By the way, I love his animations. It's just a bummer that those wings don't get used much. He also has 2 slightly different elemental bursts and a cool attack string that, for once, we actually get to use. Looking at his kit, Durin is a Pyro Sword user, but generally he will be an off-fielder and support. Thanks to his skill, he can access 2 different playstyles. Both deal a good amount of damage, but have some differences, focusing either on support or damage. These 2 playstyles change his burst, animations, and a passive talent. To choose which one you want to play, after the skill cast, you either press the skill again or you do a normal attack. When another skill is used, he will enter the confirmation of purity state. I'll just call this light mode. This is the support oriented one. Doing a normal attack instead makes him enter the denial of darkness state, and we will call this dark mode. This one focuses more on damage. The initial skill cast generates 4 pyro particles, and no matter which mode you choose, he will restore an incredibly high amount of energy. We're talking up to 33 energy at talent level 10, just by choosing the playstyle. He will also deal some pyro damage here, 1 instance with light mode and 3 with dark mode, but still applying pyro just once. The important changes, however, happen after you choose the playstyle. His burst has a 70 energy cost, 18 seconds of cooldown with 20 of duration, no matter which state he is in. Light and dark mode here start showing their differences. In light mode, he will deal 3 instances of pyro damage and then perform a coordinated attack even when off field, dealing AoE damage every second. Here, because of his special internal cooldown, pyro will actually be applied every 2 seconds. This is exactly the same application of Mavica, just with a longer duration. In dark mode instead, everything has slightly higher multipliers, but his coordinated attack will stop being AoE. It's now single target with different damage intervals, 1.25 seconds each hit, and applying pyro every 2.5 seconds. But this is not the whole picture. One important piece is missing: his passive talents. And this is where it gets interesting. In light mode, after a party member triggers any pyro-related reaction, aside from vaporize and melt, the burst will decrease resistance to pyro and whatever other element is involved in the reaction by 20%. If the team includes a second Hexerai character, the Resh Red will become 35% instead. So in light mode, Durin can decrease the enemy resistance pretty much permanently, and for every element except Cryo and Hydro. The wording for burning is slightly different here because of the way the aura works, as for example applying pyro to a burning enemy doesn't actually trigger a reaction. 20 or 35% Resh Red is already quite useful for a lot of teams. Plus, the character doesn't need to be on field to activate this effect. For example, Albedo can activate it for Pyro and Geo even without swapping to him. If instead we are in dark mode, we cover those 2 elements that we couldn't shred resistance for, Hydro and Cryo, but the effect is quite different. In dark mode, Durin's vaporize and melt damage are increased by 40%. If a second Hexerai unit is present, this becomes 70%. And this is not a damage percentage increase like pyro damage. This is a reaction bonus, additive with elemental mastery. And 40 or 70% is actually a lot for vaporize or melt damage. 40%, for example, it's basically as if Durin went from 0 elemental mastery to around 230, but without having to allocate any stats for it. 70% is as if you had 2 artifact main stats worth of elemental mastery plus a bunch of substats. It's a massive damage increase that in turn makes building elemental mastery or buffing elemental mastery not that great for him. We however have one last talent, Ascension 4, which is an upgrade to the damage of the first 10 coordinated attacks from his burst. This is an entire new multiplier, scaling 3% per 100 attack he has to a maximum of 75%. When maxed out, this passive literally means add 75% to your damage to the first 10 hits. It's pretty strong and it maxes out at 2500 attack. Let's do a quick recap of the kit now. Durin is a pyro off-fielder and possibly support. Press Q and then press it again to enter light mode. The burst will deal AoE damage every second and shred resistance depending on the pyro reaction that is being triggered, except Hydro and Cryo. Press Q but then instead do a normal attack and he will enter dark mode. Single target with different multipliers and timings. Instead of the shred, we have a big increase to his vaporites and melt damage. These effects are stronger if another Hexerai character is in the team. And lastly, he gets an energy refound by entering either state and a massive damage increase depending on how much attack he has. This is pretty much all of it. He sounds more complicated than he really is, to be honest. With all of this in mind, picking between the two playstyles should be simple. We go light mode support to help our team deal more damage. The only downside is that this cannot help Hydro and Cryo damage dealers. We go dark mode instead to cover these two specific reactions, giving up the extra damage for the team. Now let me go over a few niche aspects I noticed that I didn't include in the kit section so it wouldn't get too complicated. First off, you can totally press his burst without using his skill, and it will default to his support mode. And this might create interesting scenarios, especially in Abyss, where you can cast it directly and then get the massive energy from his skill twice before the next cast. It only has 12 seconds of cooldown after all. We can also use the skill and then later on use the burst. It will give us a buff indication on the HP bar that will remind us which playstyle will be selected next. There is also some weird play that is possible with Sacrificial, but while there is no apparent cooldown between the 4 pyro particles, there is a 6-second one for the energy refound of the skill. Honestly, you're not using this weapon anyway. Then, either playstyle also has a few differences for the burst. The light mode has a very nice AoE that is either around you or around the closest enemy. Plus, hitting multiple targets doesn't consume any extra Ascension 4 stacks, which makes Durin pretty good in AoE. Now let's look at build options and a few calcs I prepared. First off, talent priority. Almost all of his damage comes from his burst. This should be crowned or at least be as high as possible. Skill levels have unfortunately just a tiny fraction of the damage, but this is where you get the big energy refund. Each level is 3 energy that Durin is getting per cast, which means that this should be also as high as possible, so that we can allocate as many offensive stats as we can rather than energy recharge. This skill at level 10 is basically cutting in half how much energy you need, making your ER requirements trivial in most teams. For stats, everything in his kit is attack scaling, and he has a crit damage ascension stat, which gives us a very common approach in his main stats of attack, pyro damage and crit, even for vaporites and melt, since he has so much reaction damage anyway, and we need to get as close as possible to 2500 attack. And when looking at substats, it's the usual crit into attack. Yes, crit is still generally more wanted even under 2500 attack. Elemental Mastery, when used, is after both, even in scenarios that have strong attack buffs. For Orivate sets, instead we have a weird scenario. There is Emblem, and it's technically good, but thanks to his skill generating so much energy, he won't actually need that much ER. This will depend on his teams, but it will often make a set like Emblem not that strong. Sometimes better, sometimes worse than running with 2-piece plus 2-piece options. And considering that those allow you to generally have better substats, unless you lived a couple of years in the Emblem domain, then I would tend to not recommend it. A set like Noblesse can still provide very meaningful buffs, since he enjoys both parts of it, although this won't have the best uptime, as his burst has an 18 seconds cooldown. If nobody is carrying it, and unless another teammate enjoys the attack buff, this is your go-to. Lastly, Gilded and Crimson can be used when he's triggering reactions, but as we said, since he has access to other forms of reaction damage in his kit, this will be okay at best, if not plain bad. I would generally tend to recommend 2-piece plus 2-piece most of the time, ranging from burst damage to attack percentage and pyro damage. Here I listed a bunch just to showcase the possible differences for light mode. Just remember that this chart changed based on what other buffs are given to him and how strong your substats are, so take it with a grain of salt. All in all, he can do quite a lot of damage, but he doesn't really have a perfect set that synergizes with his kit. Since we will likely see more Hexerai characters eventually, it's not too unlikely we might even see a Hexerai set, but for now we're stuck with this. time to check the weapons. But first, I just want to say that I'm having a blast testing characters before release and creating content like this one, but these videos are not sponsored. And I do everything on my own, from editing to the thumbnail, calcs and testing, so if you want to support my work, consider dropping a like or a sub on this video. Let's continue. The weapon chart is going to be very long, but I made sure that this was all reflected in game one-on-one and also added some notes for the assumptions and details of each weapon. Let's cover support Durin first, the playstyle that will likely be most common. And introduced to you is signature weapon. 33.1 crit rate, 16 crit damage to his burst, and when that hits, also 20% attack. The active character also gets some attack for 16%. And if the party has two Hexerai characters, then the attack buffs are increased to 35% for himself and 28% to the active character. It also gains a graphic indication that the buff is increased by Hexerai team bonus. This is his best weapon for damage, obviously, and it's able to buff the on-fielder if they care about attack. Now, its value is a bit weird as it gets worse in teams that don't include a second Hexerai, and even worse if the on-fielder doesn't care about attack. And here I did include the weapon with only him as Hexerai character, but remember that this is so low because doing so also means losing the extra red shred from his passive talent, and I decided to account for that. You can't have one without the other after all. We then have a bunch of crit statistics that don't need much explaining, so let's jump to Wolffang. This Battle Pass weapon cannot gain stacks when Durin is off-field, but the burst cast hits 3 times and not at the same time, meaning that at least 3 stacks, if not 4, are granted and maintained for 10 seconds. Which is also around the same time we get the bigger multiplier to his first 10 hits of burst damage, making Wolffang actually very good. Lion's Roar is another 4-star weapon that ranks surprisingly high, but only when the enemy has pyro on them basically all the time. And this is not the case very often, but if it is, it's a decent 4-star. Further down, I decided to establish the 100% baseline to Moonweaver's Dawn, the new weapon that is a limited weapon, but one copy is obtainable for free from a quest. And this doesn't get the full passive, but it's better than most other things. Remember that I'm using assumptions that include a few attack buffs here, but let's move on to Dark Durin. As you can see, the difference is not that big. And even including a few weapons with elemental mastery bonuses doesn't really matter as much. Again, 70% reaction damage is like having a ton of elemental mastery. That's why they don't rank as high. And it's finally time to yap about teams. But first, I want to recap all the buffs and Hexerai stuff happening to old characters. Be aware that this will be a very quick summary as I will only go more in depth for things that matter to Durin. The most important changes will have their own entire video in this channel in the following days. So, Sucrose, Albedo, Klee, Venti, Razor, Fischl, and Mona will become Hexerai characters, with a Hexerai Secret Rite passive, and often even new buffs not directly connected to this mechanic. Sucrose has a small damage percentage buff to the team which gets stronger as C6. Albedo is very different, but too long didn't read, he does more than double his DPS and buffs damage percentage based on his defense to the party, but even more so to Hexerai characters. This can actually be useful to Durin. Klee is a much better DPS that has the ability to autocast or charge attacks, but only with another Hexerai. Venti can now be an on-field anemo damage dealer, yes, that's crazy, and he also has damage percentage to himself and active characters triggering Swirl. Durin can totally fit his team or teams where Venti is buffing another anemo character. Razor is now a legit damage dealer, I'm still stoked that this is happening, and can totally fit Durin in his teams. He basically has new multipliers and a new Constellation 6 that increases his crit value. And best for last, we have Fischl and Mona. These two can often be paired with Durin. Fischl with 2 Hexerai now buffs odds and the active character for 22.5% attack if Overload is triggered, and 90 elemental mastery if Electro Charged or Lunar Charged are. This can both be up at the same time and somehow it's not over. At C6, these buffs are doubled. So Fischl, a character that has been so useful since the game started and still finds a lot of spots in many teams, is now casually getting a 45% attack buff to herself, and it's also giving it to someone else. Or a 180 elemental mastery buff, and the crazier thing is you can have both in a team that triggers Overload and Electrocharged. Durin and Fischl, with the addition of Shebros, or to be honest even without, will make for an insanely strong core that packs high damage, resistance shred, attack buffs, a couple of useful sets, and is already equipped to cover either a Pyron fielder or an Electro one. Arlecchino, Clarent, Varese, and now even Razor and Klee perfectly work in this team and are actually going to be very strong. Mona, on the other hand, now has a way to extend the duration of her very strong buff, becoming a pseudo-Furina. Having a second Hexerai makes her normal and charge attacks increase the duration of the burst debuff by 2 seconds each up to 8 seconds. Not only that, these attacks will also stack a damage buff to Vaporize that expires the moment another party member triggers it. And then, basically all of her constellations are buffed by quite a bit. C1 is stronger for off-field units, triggering Hydra reactions. C2 is a Elemental Mastery to the entire team. C4 was 15 crit rate to attacks dealt to the Omen debuff that now has good uptime and also 15 crit damage in addition. And C6 doubles the damage of any charge attacks, making her a possible driver for Dark Durin. All in all, technically every single of these characters opens up for new teams that Durin can join in. Looking at support Durin, we basically have a Rash Shredder with great off-field damage. And this resistance decrease is even for teams that didn't previously have an easy way to obtain one. This will only stop working for Hydra and Cryo, but works for everything else as long as the reaction is triggered. Even something like Geo or Anemo or Dendro, which makes tackling teams a bit of a hard task since there are so many we can make. But one thing that will be easily overlooked is the reaction aspect. Let's say you want to play DPS Venti and slot in Bennett, Durin and Furina. Well, are we actually triggering Pyro Swirl to buff Venti here? Even if you managed it during the setup, the uptime would just be 6 seconds. So it's vital to keep in mind that we need the team to have ongoing pyro reactions for this to work. Let's go in order and check all the archetypes and elements one by one, starting from something I expect to become pretty popular: the new Overload Core. Thanks to this too, we can make very strong teams for Klee, Arlecchino, Varesa, technically Durin himself, Razor, and honestly almost any Pyro or Electro carry. And we could also not go for 2 Hexerai and adapt the teams to include someone like Jansen for Varesa or Mavuika. And here, Shivers is a no-brainer, but before C6, she's still good, don't get me wrong. It's just that the big Rash Red is a bit less wanted when Durin is already providing it. Nonetheless, the core can be extended to her, making the last slot just your Pyro or Electro DPS. And you can't really go wrong with it. And after this, we start seeing a pattern of Durin being really strong, but technically not vital, unless he's required for his Hexerai status, but while still being able to carve himself a spot almost everywhere. Geo damage dealers can utilize his off-field damage and rest, but likely require Albedo and face the competition of giving up the off-field damage for more buffs with someone like Shilonen. Although here, some like Noel and Itto are a bit outdated and even Navia often struggles to keep up. Also, we have a big problem, especially with Noel slotting in Furina as we explained earlier. We then have Danger teams, but really that is just either Burgeon teams or Kinech. Focusing on reactions and actually going full Elemental Mastery on Durin is not as bad as an idea as it might sound, as long as Lauma is also there. After all these years, we kind of still don't have a great way to use this reaction, as most Pyro units are just very awkward to play around for one reason or another. Damage-wise, you will need Lauma to stay competitive, but Durin is a Pyro option with perfect AoE application and an easier time getting his burst. Kinech on the other hand can 100% be supported by Durin, replacing or more like freeing up Mavuika for other teams. This can include Emily or Jansen, but fails to activate his Hexerai passive unless we stretch it to Fischl or Albedo. Moving on, Anemo teams really enjoy Durin. Here, he will either support together with Faruzan or replace her. As an example, this is one of the best teams for DPS Venti, which is becoming surprisingly good, and I'm releasing a video just about him very soon. Durin can also do the same to Wanderer and Shao, and technically is also an off-fielder that fully works for Chaska. And finally we have Hydro, and before looking at Dark Durin, there is still a spot in here somewhere for his support playstyle. That is when Durin is still able to trigger whatever reaction he needs to shred resistance, even if Hydro is there. For example, a Flint's team, Burgeon, or teams that include Overload plus Vaporize reactions. In here, technically Light Durin is still working just fine as a support for himself and Electro, or Dangero with the extra reaction damage. Or even just because Light Durin applies Pyro better than his Dark version and enables the Hexerai buff for other units, he can even fit teams where his Rash Shred doesn't work. This can be the case for Moalani, but here Mona is doing much of the heavy lifting of the team. The story of Dark Durin is much different. While his light version goes pretty much everywhere, as you might have noticed, the dark one is doing absolutely nothing but increase his own vaporites and melt damage, meaning that there are only 2+1 things we can do. Slot him in a cryo team where we apply a lot of the element, he stays off field, and does as much damage as possible. I don't think this is going to be played all that much. We can then slot him in a Hydra team where he's off field, and here's the Hydra aura will be very easily sustained by almost anything, and this opens up for playstyles like on-field Mona, with the new buffs, or Novilet and similar teams where we just make sure he's simply triggering vaporites. And then the probably most fun version of this playstyle, on-field Durin. With the help of Bennett C6 and a fairly forgiving charge attack playstyle, we have the possibility of playing what looks like to be one of the seriously best on-field pyro carries. And this playstyle is kind of a group effort. You want Bennett with his C6, but you also kind of want Mona and with as many constellations as possible up to C4. It still works as C0, it's just that almost every single of our constellations up to C4 is kind of pretty strong, especially 1 and 4. Then the only thing left is provide some extra Hydro up to sustain his vaporizers. This can be Furina, Yelan or Zinchu, technically more. This gets worse if you don't have Bennett C6, as you lose the vapes and generally extra pyro hits. But why not do this with Melt and get even more damage? Well, you kind of just can't. Pyro on Cryo is a forward reaction, basically he will consume all the enemy aura on every melt, easily establishing a Pyro aura, especially with Bennett C6. Then it's also hard to fit 2 Hexerai in a team like this, but I guess maybe some very sweaty rotation could allow someone like Sucrose to help out. I think I covered pretty much everyone, so are we pulling for Durin? To be honest, while he's a fantastic generalist, I also see how an account might not see as much value from him, namely accounts that rely a lot on units like Skirk or Malvika or Nether, not really having a huge spot for Durin. But otherwise, he's just incredible, and I was surprised by his damage even as an on-fielder. With everything that is happening in this patch, I couldn't be happier. As someone that started the game when it released, it's so nice to put the spotlight on these old characters, and Durin is able to help that and create new, actually competitive teams. Stay tuned on this channel as I will upload a few pretty in-depth videos about the other Hexerai characters in the upcoming days. Thank you for watching, good luck on your pulls, and see you next time.